For 32 years of marriage, I never once held my husband's hand without feeling metal between our palms. Hello there. My name is Margaret Hayes, though most folks around here still call me Maggie. I'm 73 years old now, and I live in the same farmhouse in southern Indiana that I moved into when I was barely 18 years old. The house sits at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by cornfields that stretch so far you can watch the weather coming from 3 counties away. I'm telling you this story because I carried a secret for most of my life. Not my secret, mind you. My husband's. And that secret lived in a locked room at the end of our hallway for 3 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when I was just a girl who didn't know any better. I grew up the youngest of 6 children on a tobacco farm in Kentucky. Money was tight. School ended for me after 8th grade because Daddy needed hands in the field and Mama needed help with the washing. That's just how it was back then. Nobody thought twice about it. By the time I turned 17, my older sisters had all married and moved away. I spent my days hanging laundry, churning butter, and listening to the radio while I scrubbed floors. At night, I'd lie in the room I used to share with my sisters and wonder if my whole life would be nothing but chores and borrowed hand-me-down dresses. Then one Sunday after church, my brother introduced me to a man named Thomas Hayes. Thomas was 41 years old. He wore a clean-pressed shirt and drove a Ford pickup truck that actually started on the first try. He owned 160 acres of farmland across the state line in Indiana, and he'd recently lost his wife to influenza. I remember standing there in my church dress, the blue one with the buttons that didn't quite match, while this man looked at me with serious gray eyes. He didn't smile much. He didn't make small talk. He simply said, "Your brother tells me you're a hard worker." I nodded, because I didn't know what else to do. 3 weeks later, he asked my father for permission to marry me. Daddy didn't hesitate. A widower with his own land, a house, and no debt? That was a miracle for a girl like me. Mama sewed me a wedding dress from fabric Thomas paid for himself, and on a hot June morning in 1968, I became Mrs. Thomas Hayes. The ceremony was small. Afterward, Thomas loaded my one suitcase into his truck, and we drove north on roads I'd never traveled before. I watched Kentucky disappear in the side mirror and tried not to cry. The farm appeared just before sunset. The house was bigger than anything I'd ever lived in, 2 stories, white clapboard siding, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that needed tending. Thomas helped me down from the truck. He carried my suitcase up the porch steps and said, "Welcome home, Margaret." Inside, the house smelled like old wood and pipe tobacco. Everything was neat but worn, like someone had been living there alone for too long. Thomas showed me the kitchen first. "You'll do the cooking here," he said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. Then the parlor. "We'll sit here in the evenings." Upstairs, he opened the first door. "This is our bedroom." The bed was large and covered with a quilt that looked handmade. There was a dresser, a wardrobe, and a small vanity by the window. He walked me down the hallway, opening doors one by one. "This room can be for sewing or whatever you like. This one's for storage. Guest room, if your family visits." I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. But I had seen 5 windows from the outside. And that one? I asked, pointing to the door at the very end of the hall. Thomas stopped walking. His whole body went still in a way that made my stomach tighten. He looked at that door like it might bite him. "That room stays closed," he said quietly. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. Something sharp. "You don't need to go in there, Margaret. You understand?" I nodded quickly. I'd been raised to obey. To not ask questions. To keep my head down and my mouth shut. But standing there in that dim hallway on my wedding night, I felt something cold settle into my chest. That night, after we'd eaten a quiet supper and I'd washed the dishes, Thomas went upstairs ahead of me. When I came up later, I found him standing by the bed, tucking something under his pillow. I caught just a glimpse before he pulled his hand away. A key. Long and dark, old-fashioned looking. He didn't say anything about it. He just climbed into bed, turned off the lamp, and lay on his back staring at the ceiling. I got into bed beside him and pulled the covers up to my chin. In the darkness, I could hear him breathing. I could feel the weight of his body on the other side of the mattress. But the space between us felt like miles. That first year, I learned the rhythms of the farm. I cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house clean, tended the garden, and gathered eggs each morning. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, came in for meals, and spoke only when necessary. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't harsh. He was just absent. Even when he sat across from me at the dinner table, I felt like I was eating alone. But the worst part was the nights. 2 or 3 times a week, I'd wake in the darkness to find his side of the bed empty. I'd lie there, heart pounding, listening. The creak of floorboards in the hallway. The soft scrape of metal. A door opening, then closing. And then silence. A long, heavy silence that pressed against my ears. Sometimes he was gone for 20 minutes. Sometimes an hour. He always came back smelling like dust and cold air, and he'd slip back into bed without a word. I never asked where he went. I already knew. That 5th bedroom. The one I was never supposed to enter. The one he kept locked. The one he carried the key to every single day, even when he went to town, even when he worked in the fields. That key became the only thing I could think about. I'd watch him at breakfast, his hand resting on his shirt pocket where I knew it was tucked. I'd see him reach for it unconsciously, checking that it was still there, the way some men check for their wallet. In the beginning, I told myself it was money, papers, something valuable. But you don't visit valuables in the middle of the night. You don't sit in a locked room for an hour and come back with red eyes and shallow breathing. Slowly, over months and then years, a terrible suspicion began to grow in me. There was someone else in this house. Not literally, of course. I wasn't foolish enough to believe there was a living woman hidden behind that door. But there was a ghost in this marriage. A presence I could feel but never see. Someone Thomas loved more than he could ever love me. And that thought, my dears, that thought ate at me like rust on iron. By the time our 2nd anniversary came and went, I had stopped trying to be a wife. I was just a housekeeper who shared a bed with a stranger. A stranger who kept his grief locked in a room at the end of the hall. And carried the only key next to his heart. The years passed, but nothing changed. I kept thinking it would get better. That's what Mama had told me before the wedding. Give it time, she'd said. Marriage takes patience. Men warm up slow. But Thomas didn't warm up. He just grew quieter. By our third year, we'd settled into a routine that felt more like a business arrangement than a marriage. He farmed. I kept house. We spoke only about practical things: what to plant, what needed fixing, when supplies were running low. At night, we lay in the same bed like two strangers waiting for different trains. I tried, at first, to be the kind of wife I thought he wanted. I learned to make his favorite meals. I kept the house spotless. I mended his work shirts so carefully you couldn't see where the tears had been. But nothing I did seemed to matter. He'd come in from the fields, wash up at the kitchen sink, eat his dinner without looking at me, and then sit in the parlor reading the newspaper until bedtime. And always, 2 or 3 nights a week, he'd wake in the darkness and go to that room. I started counting. 19 minutes. 42 minutes. An hour and 7 minutes. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, imagining what he was doing in there. What could possibly hold a man's attention for an hour in the middle of the night? One morning at breakfast, after a particularly long visit to the locked room, I gathered my courage. "Thomas," I said quietly, "did you sleep all right?" He looked up from his coffee, his face blank. "Fine. You got up in the night." His jaw tightened. Just slightly, but I saw it. "That's my business, Margaret." "I'm your wife," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If something's troubling you, nothing's troubling me." He stood up, grabbed his hat from the hook. "I've got work to do." The screen door slammed behind him. I sat there at the table, my breakfast going cold, and felt something crack inside my chest. That was the first time I'd tried to talk about it. It wouldn't be the last. A few months later, I tried again. We were sitting on the porch on a Sunday evening. It was one of those rare moments when he seemed almost peaceful, watching the sun go down over the fields. "Thomas," I said carefully, "we've been married 3 years now." He nodded but didn't look at me. I was wondering. I twisted my hands in my lap. "Do you think we might have children someday?" His whole body went rigid. He stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the armrest of his chair. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he stood up without a word and walked into the house. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Heard the sound of that key in that lock. He didn't come back down until after I'd gone to bed. That's when I started to understand. Whatever was in that room, it had taken up all the space in Thomas's heart. There was no room left for children. No room left for me. I was just the woman who kept his house clean and his stomach full. The loneliness of those years is hard to explain. I wasn't being beaten. I wasn't being shouted at. I had food, shelter, and a husband who provided. But I was so desperately alone. I had no friends nearby. The closest neighbor was 2 miles down the road, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who I'd see at church on Sundays. We'd exchange pleasantries, but nothing more. My family was back in Kentucky. We didn't have money for long-distance phone calls, so I'd write letters to Mama once a month. I never told her the truth. What would I say? My husband is kind enough, but he doesn't love me. He spends his nights in a locked room, mourning something I'm not allowed to know about. She would have thought I was being dramatic. Marriage isn't about romance, she would have said. It's about partnership and duty. So I kept my mouth shut and my letters cheerful. But inside, I was withering. The worst part was the not knowing. My mind filled the silence with terrible pictures. I imagined a mistress he'd kept before marrying me, a woman he still loved. I imagined love letters hidden in that room. Photographs. Gifts. Proof that I was second choice. Second best. The unwanted wife. One afternoon, when Thomas had driven into town for feed, I stood in the hallway and stared at that locked door. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. I reached out and tried the handle, even though I knew it wouldn't turn. It didn't. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I thought about breaking it down. About taking a hammer to the lock. About demanding answers. But I'd been raised to obey. To keep peace. To not make waves. So I walked away. But the jealousy stayed. It grew like mold in a damp corner, spreading into every part of my thoughts. I started to resent the door itself. I'd walk past it and feel my stomach turn. I'd lie in bed at night and imagine it mocking me. "You're not enough," it seemed to say. "You'll never be enough." By our 5th anniversary, I'd stopped hoping things would change. I moved through my days like a ghost. Cook, clean, garden, mend. The same tasks over and over, until the seasons blurred together. Thomas's hair started to gray at the temples. Lines appeared around his eyes. He moved slower, his shoulders hunched from years of farm work. But he never stopped visiting that room. Even as his body aged, that routine stayed the same. 2 or 3 times a week, he'd slip out of bed in the darkness. The floorboards would creak, the key would turn, and I'd lie there, wide awake, counting the minutes until he came back. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. He got up as usual, and I waited until I heard the door at the end of the hall close behind him. Then I got out of bed, put on my robe, and followed. I stood outside that locked door in my bare feet, my heart hammering. I could hear something inside. Not voices. Not movement. Just breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing, like someone trying not to cry. I raised my hand to knock. My knuckles were inches from the wood. But I couldn't do it. Because I was afraid of what I might find. Afraid he'd open that door and I'd see proof of what I'd always suspected, that he loved someone else more than he'd ever love me. So I lowered my hand and went back to bed. When Thomas returned 20 minutes later, I pretended to be asleep. The next morning, neither of us mentioned it. The years kept passing. 6 years. 7. 10. I turned 30. Then 35. My body started showing signs of age, lines around my mouth. Gray strands in my hair. Aches in my knees from all the years of scrubbing floors. We still had no children. My monthly cycle came and went like clockwork, regular as the seasons. There was nothing wrong with me. But Thomas never touched me anymore, not in that way. We shared a bed, but we might as well have been sleeping in separate houses. I stopped hoping, stopped praying, stopped believing things would ever be different. I accepted my life for what it was, a long, slow, lonely march toward old age with a man who kept his heart locked away. But acceptance didn't make it hurt less. One Sunday after church, Mrs. Patterson asked me how I was doing. Just a simple question. The kind people ask without expecting a real answer. I'm fine, I said automatically. She looked at me for a long moment, her old eyes sharp. You know, Margaret, you've been saying that for 15 years. And you've never looked fine once. I opened my mouth to argue, but she patted my hand. I'm not asking you to tell me what's wrong, she said gently. I'm just saying, you don't have to pretend with everyone. I drove home that day with tears running down my face. Because she was right. I'd been pretending for so long, I'd almost forgotten what the truth felt like. That night, lying in bed beside Thomas, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't spend the rest of my life competing with a locked door. I didn't know how I'd do it. I didn't know what I'd say. But somehow, someway, I was going to find out what was behind that door. Even if the truth destroyed me. Because not knowing was already killing me, piece by piece, year by year. And I deserved better than that. Even if Thomas didn't think so. I lived with that decision burning in my chest for 2 more years. 2 years of watching that hallway, of lying awake at night planning what I'd say when I finally confronted Thomas about that room. But I never did, because somewhere along the way, I realized something. Thomas wasn't going to tell me. Not willingly. Not ever. Whatever was behind that door, he'd rather die than share it with me. And as it turned out, that's almost what happened. The first sign was the headaches. Thomas started coming in from the fields earlier than usual, his face gray, his hand pressed to his temple. He'd sit at the kitchen table and close his eyes while I fixed dinner. You should see a doctor, I said one evening. It's nothing, he muttered. Just the heat. But it wasn't just the heat. The dizzy spells started a few weeks later. He'd be walking across the yard and suddenly stop, gripping the fence post until the world stopped spinning. I watched it happen from the kitchen window. Watched him stand there, swaying slightly, before he straightened up and kept walking like nothing had happened. Stubborn man. In October, he fainted in the barn. One of the hired hands, a young man named Jimmy, found him lying in the hay and drove him home in the truck. I helped Thomas inside and made him sit on the couch while I called Drive. Morris from town. The doctor came that same afternoon. He was an older man with kind eyes and a black bag that smelled like leather and antiseptic. He took Thomas's blood pressure 3 times, frowning deeper each time. When he finished, he pulled me aside in the kitchen. Mrs. Hayes, he said quietly. Your husband's blood pressure is dangerously high. If he doesn't slow down, if he doesn't take medication and rest. He paused. He's heading for a stroke. A bad one. My stomach dropped. What do I do? Get him to take these pills every day. Make sure he eats less salt. And for God's sake, get him to stop working 16-hour days. Doctor. Morris left a bottle of pills on the counter and a warning that hung in the air after he was gone. I tried to follow his instructions. I cooked meals with less salt. I put the pills on the table next to Thomas's coffee cup every morning. But Thomas was 59 years old and set in his ways. I don't need pills, he'd say, pushing them aside. I've got work to do. Thomas, please. The doctor said. The doctor doesn't run this farm. I do. He'd walk out, leaving the pills sitting there like small white accusations. I'd stand at the sink, hands shaking with frustration and fear, and wonder how you save someone who refuses to be saved. The months passed. Winter came and went. Thomas kept working, kept pushing himself, kept ignoring every warning his body gave him. And I kept watching, helpless, as he slowly wore himself down to nothing. By March, he looked 10 years older. His face was gaunt. His hands trembled when he lifted his coffee cup. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. But still, 2 or 3 nights a week, he'd get up and go to that locked room. Even dying, he couldn't let it go. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, warm for March. I was in the kitchen making bread when I heard a truck roaring up the driveway, fast and urgent. I looked out the window and saw Jimmy's old Ford skidding to a stop. He jumped out, his face white as chalk. My heart stopped before he even reached the door. "Mrs. Hayes," he shouted, banging on the screen. "It's Thomas. He collapsed in town, right outside the hardware store. They called an ambulance but he swallowed hard. It's bad. Real bad." I grabbed my purse with shaking hands. Didn't even take off my apron. Just ran to the truck and climbed in. Jimmy drove like the devil was chasing us, taking corners too fast, the engine screaming. I didn't feel any of it. I just sat there, hands clenched in my lap, praying harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. "Please, God, not yet. Not like this." The hospital was 30 miles away in the city. By the time we got there, they'd already moved Thomas to a room. A nurse met me in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral in that way medical people have when the news is bad. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband has had a major stroke. The right side of his body is affected. He's conscious, but..." She hesitated. "He can't speak clearly. And we don't know yet how much function he'll regain." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She led me to his room. Thomas lay in a narrow bed, tubes running from his arm to a bag hanging on a metal pole. His face looked lopsided, the right side slack and expressionless. But his eyes were open. And when he saw me, those eyes filled with tears. I'd never seen Thomas cry. Not once in 17 years of marriage. I went to his bedside and took his left hand, the only one that could still grip. "Thomas," I whispered. "I'm here. I'm right here." He tried to speak. His mouth moved, but the sounds came out thick and garbled. Room. I leaned closer, my ear next to his lips. "Room. Forgive. Margaret." His fingers tightened around mine with desperate strength. "Forgive. Room. Forgive." Then his eyes rolled back and the machines started beeping frantically. Nurses rushed in and I was pushed aside, standing against the wall while they worked over him. I don't know how long I stood there. Time felt broken. Eventually, a doctor came out and told me Thomas had stabilized. They were going to keep him for observation. The next 72 hours would be critical. I stayed at the hospital for 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside his bed. Thomas woke occasionally, but he couldn't form full sentences. Just fragments. Just those same words over and over. Room. Forgive. On the 4th day, they said I could take him home. He'd need constant care, physical therapy, medications. The stroke had damaged him badly. His right arm hung useless. His right leg dragged when he tried to walk. But he was alive. Jimmy helped me get Thomas into the house and up to our bedroom. We settled him into bed, propped up with pillows. I thanked Jimmy and sent him home. Then I sat in the chair beside the bed and finally let myself cry. I cried for the stubborn man who'd worked himself into a stroke. I cried for the 17 years we'd wasted living like strangers. I cried for myself, and the lonely woman I'd become. When the tears stopped, I went downstairs to unpack the small bag the hospital had given me with Thomas's clothes. I pulled out his work pants, still dusty from the day he collapsed. And that's when I felt it. Something hard and cold in the right pocket. My hand closed around it before my brain could catch up. The key. I stood there in our bedroom, staring at the piece of iron in my palm. For 17 years, Thomas had kept this key on his body every single day. He'd guarded it more carefully than his wallet, his wedding ring, anything. And now it was in my hand. I looked at Thomas sleeping in the bed. His face was peaceful for once, the lines of pain and stubbornness smoothed away by exhaustion. "Forgive," he'd said. "Room. Forgive." Was he asking permission? Was he trying to tell me something he'd never been able to say out loud? I closed my fingers around the key and felt its weight. All these years, I'd imagined confronting him, demanding answers, fighting for my right to know. But this wasn't how I'd pictured it. Not with him broken and helpless, barely able to speak. I sat down in the rocking chair by the window and stared at that key until the sun went down and the room filled with shadows. In the bed, Thomas murmured in his sleep, "Room. Forgive." And suddenly, I knew what I had to do. Not for him. Not even for us. For me. Because I'd spent 17 years being afraid of the truth. Afraid of what I'd find. Afraid that knowing would hurt worse than not knowing. But living with that fear had already destroyed me. There was nothing left to lose. I stood up, the key clenched tight in my fist. I walked out of the bedroom and down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood in front of that door I'd been forbidden to open for 17 years. And this time, I wasn't going to walk away. My hands shook as I fitted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff from years of use by only one person's hand. Then it turned with a heavy click that echoed through the empty hallway. I took a breath, and I pushed the door open. The door swung open with a long, slow creak. Dust hit my face first. Thick and old, like opening a tomb. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hand still on the knob, my eyes trying to make sense of what I was seeing in the darkness. Then I reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered once, twice, then stayed on, casting weak yellow light across the room. And my whole world tilted sideways. It was a nursery. The walls were painted pale yellow, faded now but still soft. Someone had painted a border near the ceiling, little white daisies and butterflies, done by hand with careful brush strokes. In the center of the room stood a wooden crib with a white lace canopy, now yellowed with age. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs carried me forward without permission, like I was walking through water. The crib was made up. A tiny mattress with a flannel sheet. A crocheted blanket folded at the foot. And sitting against the pillow was a cloth doll with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. I reached out and touched the doll. The fabric was dusty but intact. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Against the far wall stood a small dresser painted white. On top sat a silver hairbrush, a music box shaped like a carousel, and 3 picture frames. I walked to the dresser like I was in a dream. A bad dream. The kind where you're trying to scream but no sound comes out. The first photograph showed a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pinned back and soft eyes. She wore a simple dress and held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. The baby's face was barely visible, just a tiny nose and closed eyes. But the woman was smiling. A real smile, full of joy and tiredness and love. I picked up the frame with trembling hands. On the back, written in faded ink, Iris and Charlotte. August 1954. The air left my lungs. The second photograph showed the same baby, older now. Maybe 2 years old. She sat on a blanket in the grass, wearing a white dress with smocking across the chest. Dark curls. Thomas's gray eyes. A huge grin showing tiny teeth. The third picture was Thomas. But not the Thomas I knew. This Thomas was younger, maybe 30. He stood in front of this very house, holding that same little girl on his hip. She had her arms around his neck, and he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. I'd never seen that expression on his face. Not once. I set the frame down carefully because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I opened the top drawer of the dresser. Baby clothes. Folded with precision. Little dresses no bigger than my hand. Tiny socks. A christening gown made of delicate lace. I lifted one of the dresses and held it up. It was pink with white flowers embroidered on the collar. Who had made this? Who had dressed this child? I opened the second drawer. Inside was a wooden box. I lifted it out, set it on top of the dresser, and opened the lid. Letters. Dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and picked up the first letter. The paper was thin, the ink brown with age. The handwriting was feminine, careful. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, it means I did not survive the birth. Dr. Patterson has warned me that my heart is weak, that carrying this baby is dangerous. But I cannot bear to end this pregnancy. This child is ours, and I want her to live, even if I cannot. Please, my love, do not let grief consume you. Raise our daughter with joy. Teach her to laugh. Tell her about me, but do not let me become a shadow in her life. And when enough time has passed, when your heart has healed, please try to love again. You deserve happiness, Thomas. You deserve a full life. I will always be with you, but do not let me keep you from living. All my love, Iris. The letter fell from my hands. I couldn't see through the tears anymore. They came fast and hard, shaking my whole body. I sank to my knees on that dusty floor and sobbed. Not for myself. Not anymore. For the woman who wrote that letter knowing she would die. For the man who lost his wife and tried to raise their daughter alone. For the little girl whose clothes still sat folded in drawers 17 years after she'd last worn them. I don't know how long I knelt there. Time felt broken. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. To keep looking. To understand. I went to the small closet and opened it. More clothes. Shoes so tiny they fit in my palm. A winter coat with a fur-trimmed hood. A little sweater with ducks knitted into the pattern. On the closet floor was a cardboard box. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were toys. A wooden rocking horse. A set of blocks with letters carved into the sides. A stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. And underneath everything, a manila envelope. I pulled it out. My name was written on the front in Thomas's handwriting. Margaret. Just my name. Nothing else. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a birth certificate. Charlotte Rose Hayes. Born August 14, 1954. Mother Iris Hayes. Father Thomas Hayes. The second was a death certificate. Charlotte Rose Hayes. Died March 8, 1957. Age 2 years, 6 months. Cause of death pneumonia. I read it 3 times before the words made sense. 2.5 years old. She'd only lived 2.5 years. And Iris. The letter said she feared she wouldn't survive the birth. I went back to the box of letters and found another one, this one in different handwriting. Older. Shakier. Mr. Hayes. I am deeply sorry to inform you that your wife, Iris Hayes, passed away during childbirth on August 14, 1954, at 3:17 in the morning. We did everything we could, but the hemorrhaging could not be stopped. Your daughter, however, is healthy and strong. My deepest condolences. Dr. Samuel Patterson. I pressed my hand to my mouth to hold back the sound trying to escape. He'd lost them both. His wife died giving birth to their daughter. And then he'd raised that little girl alone for 2.5 years before losing her too. I looked around the room again with new eyes. This wasn't a shrine to another woman. This was a father's grief turned into stone. Every toy arranged just so. Every piece of clothing folded and preserved. Every photograph dusted and maintained. He'd kept this room exactly as it was the day Charlotte died. For 20 years. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. Below the window was a child-sized rocking chair. I sat down in it, my knees pulled up awkwardly, and I let myself cry again. All those years, I'd been jealous of this. I'd imagined another woman, a rival, someone more beautiful, more loved, more worthy. But there was no rival. Just a broken man who couldn't let go of the family he'd lost. Just a room full of absence. Just a father who visited his dead daughter in the middle of the night because it was the only place he could still feel close to her. Oh, Thomas, I whispered to the empty room. Why didn't you tell me? But I knew why. Because how do you tell someone you're still in love with a ghost? How do you explain that you remarried not for love, but because you couldn't stand the silence anymore? How do you say, I brought you here to fill the empty spaces, but the spaces are still empty because nobody can replace what I lost? I stood up from the little rocking chair and took one last look around the room. The crib with its lace canopy. The dresser with its photographs. The closet full of clothes that would never be worn again. This room was Thomas's heart, preserved in yellowed paint and dust. And I'd been locked out of it for 17 years. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he couldn't bear to share it. I picked up the photograph of Thomas holding Charlotte and carried it with me as I walked to the door. I turned off the light, but I didn't close the door. And I didn't lock it. That room had been locked long enough. I walked down the hallway and into our bedroom where Thomas slept fitfully, his face still lopsided from the stroke. I sat down beside him and placed the photograph on his chest. Then I took his good hand in both of mine and whispered, "I know, Thomas. I know about Iris. I know about Charlotte. And I'm so sorry." His eyes opened. Slowly, painfully, he looked down at the photograph. Then up at me. And for the first time in 17 years of marriage, my husband looked at me like I was real. His face crumpled. His mouth opened in a silent cry. Then the sound came. A deep, wrenching sob that seemed to be pulled from the center of his body. He cried like a man who'd been holding it in for 20 years. And I held him while he broke. Thomas couldn't speak clearly for weeks after the stroke. But we didn't need words anymore. The morning after I opened that room, I helped him out of bed and down the hallway. He leaned heavily on me, his right leg dragging, his breath coming hard. When we reached the open door, he stopped. He stared into that room like he was seeing it for the first time in 20 years. Then he looked at me, tears streaming down his face, and managed one clear word. "Sorry." I shook my head. "Don't. Just don't." We stood there together in the doorway, and I felt something shift between us. Something that had been twisted and knotted for 17 years finally loosened. That afternoon, I brought 2 chairs into the room. We sat side by side facing the crib, and Thomas began to talk. His words came slowly, slurred and halting. But I was patient. I had waited 17 years. I could wait a little longer. He told me about Iris. How they'd met at a church social when he was 28 and she was 23. How she'd had a weak heart since childhood, something about rheumatic fever that had damaged it. How the doctor warned them that pregnancy would be dangerous. She wanted the baby anyway, he said, his good hand gripping mine. Said, "Some things worth the risk." He told me about the night Charlotte was born. How Iris had labored for 18 hours. How he'd sat outside the bedroom door listening to her scream, feeling helpless. How the midwife finally came out at dawn and said, "You have a daughter, but your wife." He couldn't finish that sentence. He never could. But he told me about Charlotte. How she had Iris's smile. How she used to toddle after him through the house calling, "Dada," until he picked her up. How she loved the wind and would stand in the yard with her arms spread wide, laughing. She got sick that winter, he said. Coughing. Fever. I drove to town. Got medicine. But when I came back, he broke down then. I held his hand and waited. Found her. In the crib. Already gone. She was so small. So cold. My heart broke for him all over again. After the funeral, he continued slowly, I closed that door. Couldn't look. Couldn't breathe. Just locked it. "And you kept visiting," I said softly. He nodded. "Every week. Then, every few days. Had to see her things. Remember her laugh. Couldn't let go. And when you married me." His face crumpled with shame. "Needed someone. House too quiet. Too empty. But couldn't." He struggled for the words. "Couldn't let you in. To the room. To that part. Because it would make it real," I said. "That she was really gone." He looked at me with such gratitude that I understood. He'd needed someone to finally understand. I'm not angry, I told him. Not anymore. I just wish you'd told me sooner. Scared? He whispered. Thought you'd leave. I squeezed his hand. I'm not leaving, Thomas. Not now. Over the following weeks, we transformed that room together. It was slow work. Thomas could only manage short periods before exhausting himself, and I had to do most of the physical labor. But we did it side by side. We cleaned every surface. I washed the curtains and the tiny clothes, folding them carefully into a cedar chest Thomas brought down from the attic. We took down the crib and stored it in the barn, replacing it with a small table covered with a white linen cloth. On that table, we placed the photographs in their frames, Iris holding baby Charlotte, Charlotte grinning in the grass, Thomas with his daughter on his hip. We added a vase that I kept filled with fresh flowers from the garden. We set a candle in a glass holder, the kind you see in churches. We turned that room from a frozen moment into a place of memory. A place we could visit together. The change in Thomas was remarkable. As his speech slowly improved, he started talking more. Not just about Iris and Charlotte, but about everything. About the farm, about his childhood, about his hopes for the future. For the first time in our marriage, we had real conversations. We'd sit in that room some evenings, me in the rocking chair and him in the other chair, and he'd tell me stories about Charlotte. How she'd loved to help him feed the chickens. How she'd insisted on wearing her Sunday dress every single day. How she'd given every barn cat a different name. And slowly, I told him about my own loneliness during those 17 years. About the nights I'd lain awake wondering what I'd done wrong. About the jealousy that had eaten at me. You didn't do anything wrong, he said one evening. Was me. All me. We both could have tried harder, I said. We both could have been braver. He reached for my hand. Being brave now. Together. And we were. Thomas lived for 6 more years after that stroke. They weren't easy years. He never fully recovered. His right side stayed weak. He couldn't work the farm anymore, so we hired help and I managed the books. He walked with a cane and tired easily. But they were good years. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sunset. We'd eat meals together and actually talk. We'd visit that small memorial room upstairs, light the candle, and sit in comfortable silence. On our 23rd anniversary, Thomas gave me a gift. It was a small velvet box, and inside was a locket on a silver chain. When I opened it, I found 2 tiny photographs. On one side was Charlotte. On the other was Iris. So you carry them, too, he said. Part of the family. I put that locket on and I never took it off. In the spring of his 65th year, Thomas had another stroke. A massive one. I found him in the morning, still in bed, his breathing shallow and irregular. The ambulance came. The doctors did what they could. But this time, his body had nothing left to give. I sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand as the machines beeped their steady rhythm. His eyes opened one last time. He looked at me with perfect clarity and said 3 names. Iris, Charlotte, Margaret. Then he smiled. A real smile, peaceful and complete. And he was gone. At the funeral, I buried him next to Iris and Charlotte in the little cemetery on the hill behind the church. 3 stones in a row, finally together. I'm 73 years old now. I still live in that farmhouse, though I rent out the land to a young family. Every afternoon, I climb those stairs slower now, my niece complaining, and I go into that room. I sit in the rocking chair and look at the photographs on the table. 4 frames now. Iris, Charlotte, Thomas, and one of me and Thomas taken on our last anniversary. A family, finally complete. I talk to them sometimes. Tell them about my day. About the grandniece who visits on weekends. About the barn cat who had kittens in the spring. And I think about all those wasted years. All that pain we both carried alone when we could have carried it together. That's why I'm telling you this story, my dears. Because I see so many people now, especially in my generation, walking around with locked rooms in their hearts. Secrets they're too afraid to share. Grief they think they have to bear alone. Shame that keeps them silent. And I want you to know something. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you think is too terrible or too painful to share, it's not. The hiding is what hurts you. The silence is what kills you. I spent 17 years competing with a ghost, feeling unloved and unwanted, when all along my husband was drowning in grief he didn't know how to share. We both suffered alone when we could have helped each other heal. Don't do what we did. Don't waste decades being afraid. If you're carrying something heavy, tell someone. A friend, a spouse, a therapist, a pastor. Anyone who will listen without judgment. If someone you love seems distant, don't assume the worst. Ask. Keep asking. Be patient. And if you discover that the person you've been jealous of all along is just a memory, a loss, a pain they couldn't voice, be kind. Be understanding. Because we're all just trying to survive our own heartbreaks. Thomas and I lost so many years to fear and silence. But we found each other in the end, and those last 6 years were worth the wait. They were worth everything. That room at the end of the hall used to represent everything I couldn't have. Everything I wasn't good enough for. Everything that stood between me and happiness. Now it's my favorite room in the house. Because it's where I learned that love isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about making room for all of it, the past and the present, the grief and the joy, the living and the dead. It's all part of the same story. My story, Thomas's story, Iris's story, Charlotte's story, and now, yours. Thank you for listening, my dears. Thank you for letting this old woman share the story that shaped her life. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the locked rooms in your own life, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to the Grandmama Radio channel. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the other stories I have to share. Because at the end of the day, stories are what connect us. They remind us we're not alone in our struggles, our losses, our hopes. And sometimes, that's all we need to know, that someone else understands. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, the door is always worth opening. Even if it takes you 17 years to find the courage. God bless.